Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, joined as always by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, our prep, I guess, for the 2025 fantasy season continues here after we went over some early ADP battles the past couple of weeks at running back and wide receiver. And now we're going to dive into early ADP a little bit more and identify kind of some of the players whose values we don't necessarily love. But Nate, even before we get into that, we have several new signings that happened since we last recorded, including Aaron Rodgers finally signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Nick Chubb signing with the Houston Texans, and then most recently, J.K. Dobbins signs with the Denver Broncos. So plenty of relevant news for fantasy happening here in the past week. So how you doing, and how do you feel about these recent NFL moves here?
I'm doing well. It's a fun time of year. It's the no longer voluntary camps for the players that they have to show up to. So now we get all these coaches' quotes hyping up every single player they have on their roster. So it's fun trying to dig in and see what's true and what's not true and what's just hype and what could happen. But definitely interesting time of year. And like you said, had a bunch of interesting signings these past couple of days, especially at running back, the two big names that we've been waiting for a long time. I'll start with J.K. Dobbins since that's freshest in my head since that just happened yesterday. I like the move for Denver, and I'm not all that concerned with R.J. Harvey here. I think this is going to be more of a two-man backfield. It feels like kind of a full circle moment since I think I'll kind of have that Mark Ingram role in the offense, play those two downs where Harvey will play more of that passing role like Alvin Kamara had, and Ingram and Dobbins were teammates for that 1 year in Baltimore, so having that go full circle in Sean Payton's offense, kind of fun there. But I think the two can coexist just fine. I think Dobbins can take those early downs, should hopefully see double-digit carries each week. Harvey should still get a ton of targets and get some of those rushing attempts. So for me, I didn't move Harvey down too much, but I think a lot of it just depends on what you were hoping for Harvey prior to the signing. Some people were hoping he'd play 60+% of snaps, and I don't think that was going to happen, even with the running backs they had on the roster. So that first move, I was fine with it from a perspective for Harvey. I think it's just really bad news for Audric Estime, Julian McLaughlin. I was both planning on writing player profiles on both of them. Now I'm not going to. Now I'll write one on Dobbins and someone else.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It makes perfect sense, right? I think, we've talked about the Sean Payton backfield a little bit here in recent weeks, and especially coming out of the draft with RJ Harvey. And I'm with you. I think, the passing down role for Harvey should still be a good one if that's the role that he's going to be kind of pigeonholed into here with J.K. Dobbins playing the early downs, right? So one of the things I remember we talked about was the Saints, Sean Payton's Saints specifically being like one of the leaders in targets and receptions to the running back position. And part of that is just having Alvin Kamara, right, who's, an elite receiving threat out of the backfield. But then that even continued last year with Denver and Javonte Williams in the backfield. So it didn't really matter who he had back there. And I think RJ Harvey can still be fine, like you said, playing that role. So yeah, it's obviously a great NFL move for them to add somebody like Dobbins if he can stay healthy and be effective. But I don't think, like you said, it's not the end of the world here for what RJ Harvey could be for us in year one here with Denver. So on the other side, I mean, Nick Chubb, look, we saw what he kind of looked like last year coming off the injury. It wasn't great, obviously. It was not the Nick Chubb that we remembered, but another year removed from the injury. He passed his physical with the Texans. Could he be somebody that you think maybe potentially eats into Joe Mixon's snap share? Because I know a lot of people were excited about Woody Marks maybe taking that role, the rookie, but I think Nick Chubb probably brings a little bit better of a resume than Woody Marks. So what are you thinking here with Chubb in Houston?
Yeah, first Woody Marks, we thought he would be a passing down back and all the optimism of maybe he could be the backup too and then the handcuffs so if something were to happen, but that seems a lot less likely now. So Marks, I still expect him to get on the field. If you're in a league where you start 4 running backs or something, Marks could have value, but outside of that. But I do think this does impact Joe Mixon. Throughout Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb's career, their roles have been 2 down backs, not playing on third downs, and now they're on the same team doing that. So I think Chubb will cut into Mixon's playing time at least a little bit. Mixon is among the career league leaders in rushing attempts, so I expect Mixon's workload to get toned down at least a little bit. They were relying on him very heavily at times last year, so I think this does hurt Mixon, and I think there's at least a chance that like if Nick Chubb does start to be the player he once was, Chubb at his best is better than Mixon at his best, and the Texans can move on from Mixon next year if they want. This is a new offensive coordinator, not the exact same coaching staff that brought in Mixon, so there's at least a chance that Chubb can overtake the backfield. So I think that makes him a decently intriguing handcuff option because he doesn't just have the handcuff value, he also has the value of potentially being the starter and potentially being the same player he once was. But like even then, this Texans offensive line is not great. Chubb these past couple years has been very reliant on the offensive line. The offensive line getting worse in Cleveland has been part of Chubb's not playing as well in Cleveland. So the offensive line will be a problem. So even if Chubb as a player can get back to the player he once was, I don't think he can get back to the production he once had because the offensive line isn't as good.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then obviously Mixon being there too, like it is going to keep him from, taking probably over that RB1 role if he doesn't become the running back that he once was. I don't really expect him to get back to that form, but I think he can definitely be better than what he was last year, right? Just again, another year healthier. Hopefully that helps him. And yeah, I agree. Like I think Chubb will eat into Joe Mixon's opportunities. It just makes sense, right? Like not just Houston relying on Mixon last year a ton, but like for how many years in Cincinnati, this guy has a ton of mileage under him. And he's been very reliable. He's been relatively healthy for the position. But at the same time, I think, as he's getting older, it makes sense that they would want to kind of lighten that load a little bit here heading into 2025. So, yep, makes perfect sense to me. And then, I mean, last one that has made sense for a while, but the Pittsburgh Steelers, for whatever reason, just delayed and delayed and delayed. But eventually, Aaron Rodgers is now the starting quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And personally, like my first thought was, well, it's better than Mason Rudolph. But any more optimism than that for you, Nate, for the Steelers and their offense?
It's an awkward fit. It's unclear how this offense is going to run. Arthur Smith has run a completely different offense than what Aaron Rodgers has in the past. Rodgers relying a lot on motions and play action and that kind of stuff. And Arthur Smith has been just a very straightforward, let's run outside zone and run a lot of run plays. Rodgers is used to running a lot of pass plays. So even that simple, how often are they going to run the ball versus how often are they going to pass the ball? They've both been at two pretty different extremes. And now his top wide receiver is DK Metcalf, a contested catch, clear X receiver, where Rodgers likes receivers who have a lot of nuance in their routes, and that's not who DK Metcalf has been. Metcalf has been the I cannot physical you, and he's been able to do that and have success doing that. So, also, how is Rodgers and DK Metcalf going to exist? And it's like there's been reports that this was the Steelers' third plan with Justin Fields, and I think Matthew Stafford was their top hope at quarterback. So I don't feel like they signed DK Metcalf and gave him a long-term deal because they wanted to pair him with Aaron Rodgers. I think they just wanted DK Metcalf, and Rodgers is just the best option they have. So I think a lot of reasons this offense is going to be a little weird. I didn't move DK Metcalf up all that much because I also partially thought Aaron Rodgers was going to be the quarterback anyway. The only player that I was like decently happy with is Jalen Warren because Rodgers does have a pretty strong history of throwing to running backs. He was doing it a decent amount before, both with the Packers and the Jets. So I think Warren will still see a lot of targets, and Rodgers has tended to not like rookies quite as much in recent seasons, so a chance that he might like Warren better than Caleb Johnson, even though if this is Arthur Smith's offense, then Johnson is still going to run the ball a lot anyway. So a lot of question marks, but I think Warren was the one person that I'm like, I'm at least okay with Warren's value here. Everyone else feels up in the air. Rodgers is like probably a borderline starter in super flex leagues. Metcalf is still probably only in that wide receiver 3 or so range for me.
Yeah, that's the way it feels. I mean, obviously, again, like Aaron Rodgers, this isn't MVP version of Aaron Rodgers at this point in his career, right? But he is at least a competent and capable NFL quarterback who can run a passing game if that's the way that they're going to go. But like you said, it's a weird offense because we don't know exactly who's going to have control there. And at the very least, maybe there's hope for them to be able to support a second wide receiver for fantasy. I don't know who that's going to be. I'm kind of hopeful that it's Roman Wilson. I liked him as a potential option, but they got some other pieces there who are comparable. So it'll be, yeah, mostly I think DK Metcalf, Jalen Warren, like you said, those are going to be the two main options, and Caleb Johnson. So we'll see what happens with Aaron Rodgers. I'm not overly hopeful for this Steelers offense as a whole, but it's definitely better than what it seemed at least before last week.
I'll add Calvin Austin as someone else who could be
Calvin
that
Austin,
like
yeah.
surprise wide receiver along with Roman Wilson. I think either one could potentially have a big breakout season if they become Rodgers' favorite target, which all goes out the window once they trade for Allen Lazard, but that's okay.
Right, Alan Lazard and Jonnu Smith, who will also kind of rotate in there eventually once they trade for those guys. But yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, today focusing on what we're going to be kind of spending the most of our time on, which is going to be players to, well, at least that we're looking to kind of avoid right now at cost, right? And that's kind of the main thing here for ADP. We're looking at it. It's still early. It's June. None of the ADP. There's still time for this stuff to change, but we're going to look at some of the players who I think we came in a little bit lower on. I think both of your rankings have been set for a while now. My rankings are about set and ready to release next week. So I think we were able to come up with some players who we just don't love the value of. And I don't like to be overly negative on players in general, and that's not really what this is about, right? It's more again about finding the players that are currently being valued, and who they're being valued over. Excuse me, which is how I always kind of approach these sort of overvalued or players to avoid topics, however we want to phrase it. So just keep that in mind here as we work through these names, because most of the time, if the price is right, we will invest. But the point here is that we feel the price might not be right. So let's get into it, Nate. And maybe we should start at the quarterback position first, because this was maybe the position that at least I struggled to find like an ADP that I dislike the most. And not to say that I'm lockstep with ADP throughout my rankings, but more so that I currently don't feel as strongly, I guess, about the values being way off. But I know you've picked at least a couple of values that you're not feeling right now. So let's start with the first one, which is Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott going as QB 14 on Underdog right now and QB 15 on Sleeper. So what is it about Dak that has you lower on him right now, Nate?
First off, I was concerned about his level of play last year and just in general recently. He's graded below 70 in terms of passing grade in 2 of the past 3 seasons. It was really his accuracy rate that dropped off considerably last year, was in the mid 60s, the most recent seasons, and then last year it was down to 52.9%. So the accuracy of his passes was not great. He's also coming off an injury. He was already rushing at career low rates last year, so he wasn't someone who brought a ton of rushing production, but that's been even lower. And after a hamstring injury, I don't expect that to rebound. And then the big thing here is the schedule for the Cowboys. Dak Prescott, among quarterbacks, like every player, they play better against bad defenses. They don't do as well against good defenses. That's generally true. But for Prescott's fantasy production, that's been even more so true than most quarterbacks. Over the past 3 seasons, he's averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game when facing a defense in the bottom quarter of the league or the top quarter and allowing fantasy points per game those seasons, and then 15.1 fantasy points per game in all other games. So even average defenses, even slightly above average, it's been in that range. And he's been pretty lucky with his schedule over these past couple of years. 40% of his games have been against teams that are in the bottom 8 of the league or top 8 in allowing fantasy points. So he's been very lucky with the schedules in the past. This season, 9 of the 17 games on his schedule are against top 10 defenses. Only 2 are against bottom 10 defenses. So a lot tougher schedule this season. Obviously, defenses are going to change. Defenses will get better or worse from last year to this year. And those top 10 and bottom 10 numbers are based on last season. So while things will change, it'll probably get a little bit more favorable. It's still not going to be as favorable as it was in the past. So for me, because of the schedule changes and because of Prescott's not quite as good play recently, along with less rushing, I think that all adds up to a quarterback that, yeah, you can probably start him in a couple of games this season, but I probably don't want to start him in very many games. And when there are so many young, high upside quarterbacks, especially in these single quarterback leagues where you're drafting someone and then you're drafting a backup to be that high upside option, if you're just looking at the second year quarterbacks, someone like Drake May, someone like JJ McCarthy, someone like Michael Penix. Bo Nix is already getting drafted much higher. Jaden Daniels already getting drafted much higher. So lots of options for you to get a high upside player at quarterback for your backup rather than Prescott, who, unless you know what bye week your quarterback has and you specifically want Prescott for that bye week, I'm probably not drafting for that reason. So super flex league, still fine to get him as a quarterback too, just not where he's currently getting drafted though.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like I'm definitely slightly lower on Dak than consensus as well. I think I have him as QB 17 right now, just because even before the injury last season, like you said, like he didn't look nearly as good as he did in 2023. And 2023, to be fair, like that was a career year for him in terms of passing grade. But then last year was career low for him in terms of passing grade. Right now, he only got to play half a season, so maybe he could have turned that around before the end of the year if he was healthy. But we can only work with the data that we have with him last season, and that wasn't really that of a top 15 fantasy quarterback. That being said, like it's not, I don't hate it for him. Like he's just 1 year removed from that best season when he did finish as like a top 5 fantasy quarterback overall. Brian Schottenheimer was the offensive coordinator for that season as well. He's now the head coach. There are some good weapons in the passing game for Dak. Obviously, a great one with CeeDee Lamb, and then George Pickens, Jake Ferguson as well. So like I could see the world where Dak outperforms his ADP this year, or at the very least returns that kind of value. I just think, like you said, I can make as strong or better of an argument for those guys going around him, guys like CJ Stroud or Drake May or Jared Goff and JJ McCarthy. Like you said, I think they all either have similar situations on offense, or in May's situation, at least brings like a solid rushing upside to his fantasy potential, where Dak doesn't really have that at all. And those are the kind of guys going into that similar range. So yes, some of them later than Dak as well. So those are kind of the quarterbacks that I'm gravitating toward in my rankings right now. Like you said, just targeting some more of that upside in that QB2 spot than kind of the safer option in Dak Prescott.
I'll just add Trevor Lawrence as another one of those
Trevor Lawrence,
quarterbacks
yeah.
in those range a little lower that I like as well.
Yep, good call. Now, another quarterback going in a similar range in drafts at the moment is Los Angeles Chargers quarterback Justin Herbert, though quite different in ADP right now, depending on where you're drafting him, because he's like QB 16 on Underdog and QB 11 on Sleeper. I have him right at QB 16 right now, Nate. So far from that kind of QB 11 ADP on Sleeper, because again, I think there's potentially more fantasy upside to target before Herbert comes off the board as well. So how are you feeling about Justin Herbert heading into 2025?
First off, love Herbert as a player. I think he's one of the top quarterbacks in the league, one of the top passers in the league. I don't think that's in question here. A lot of it for me is Greg Roman and his offense and what the Chargers did this offseason. We saw last year, the first 4 weeks of the season, the Chargers were the most run-heavy team, which is consistent with what Greg Roman has done throughout his career with the 49ers and Bills and Ravens. They were running 51% of the time, where league average was around 40%. During that stretch, Herbert was only passing 23 times per game, which is a very low amount for a quarterback, was leading to 125 to 180 passing yards per game. And he also wasn't playing very well during that stretch. He played much better the rest of the season. But even if you take how he played the rest of the season and put it at that low passing attempts per game, that's still only around 182 passing yards, give or take. Decent amount, but that's still not nearly enough for what you want for your fantasy starting quarterback. He averaged 11.3 fantasy points per game during that stretch, so among the lowest among quarterbacks in that time. But again, if he plays really well like he did the rest of last season, that's only around 13 or 14 fantasy points per game, which still isn't anywhere close to being a fantasy starter. The Chargers changed their offense dramatically after that point, only ran 38.1% of the time the rest of the year. They realized they didn't trust their run game as much anymore. Herbert was grading as an elite passer. That led to 19.4 fantasy points per game, which is generally good for a low-end quarterback one. That still wasn't passing at a very high rate, certainly not what we've seen from Herbert at earlier points in his career, but still that's a low end quarterback one. And now they added Omarion Hampton, they added Najee Harris. That's going to increase how much they run the ball, no matter how good Justin Herbert is. So even if it's somewhere in between where they started last year and where they finished last year, if it's in the middle of those points, then that's only 15 to 16 fantasy points per game. And that's with Herbert passing the ball at a very high level. So fantasy is very much a volume game. And for me, the concern with Herbert is entirely around his volume.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm definitely with you. Like for all the same reasons as to why I have Herbert outside my top 15 quarterbacks right now, and I think there's a good chance that they lean into the run more this season, especially after drafting Omari and Hampton in the first round. They added Najee Harris in free agency. Like the signs are there that this is a team that wants to run more. Now they were obviously still above average in run rate on the year last year as a whole, but like you said, that shifted from being one of the most run heavy teams in the league last season to start the year. And I imagine that based on Greg Roman's history, and again, the first round investment at running back, like they'd likely like to get back to that a little bit more. Now, I agree too. Like I really like Herbert as an NFL quarterback. He's very good. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He even just completed his best season in terms of PFF passing grade with a 90.2. That was third to kind of back that up. But like you pointed out, Nate, that doesn't always necessarily mean it'll translate to high end fantasy potential, because even with like nearly 4,000 passing yards, a career year in passing grade, big time throw rate, all those things, he played every single game and then still just finished as the QB 13, right? So as we kind of project ahead with potentially more running from the offense. And you never know if there's a regression to Herbert's mean in terms of those career passing numbers as well. Like it's really hard to keep him in that top 12 fantasy conversation where he is on sleeper right now. I think underdog is much more in line here. It's where I have him outside that top 15 of quarterbacks because, yeah, I just think the paths to like top 12 for guys like Justin Fields and Caleb Williams and CJ Stroud, Drake May are a little bit clearer, at least in my opinion. So he was the one that I kept kind of pushing down as I was sorting my ranks as well.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting philosophy of like what you want in your backup quarterback. If you want a safe, reliable option, Herbert's definitely there. I think Herbert is going to rank around there in terms of like his total points at the end of the year. But I'd rather draft someone that's a little more volatile, that has the chance of being a top five fantasy quarterback, like the JJ McCarthy we've seen with Vikings offenses, how helpful that is to quarterbacks. I would say McCarthy has a better chance of being a top five quarterback, even if the mean circumstance has Herbert being the better quarterback. So it depends what you want in your backup quarterback. And in super flex leagues, like Herbert's a very safe quarterback two option.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's not something we're talking about today necessarily, but I like couldn't help but think like as far as like players that I think are undervalued for quarterback, like JJ McCarthy, Drake May, I think are two of those guys that really kind of stood out to me, who I think could have some better value for fantasy than where they're currently being drafted. But we're focusing on the other side of that for today. So we'll move on from the quarterback position, which I mean, like the quarterback position as a whole, I feel like it's in a really good spot this season, as it was last year as well. That there are plenty of quality starters with fantasy potential, really going all the way through, like even the top 24. Like I think you could make an argument for most of the other guys in that range to push for like a top 12 finish this season if things go their way. And I don't think it would be crazy. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these things shake out at quarterback this year, because yeah, I feel pretty good that this is one of the better years for the position for fantasy as well. But let's head to the running back position next, Nate, and we've got three names here whose ADPs we don't necessarily love at the moment. So let's start with one of your picks, Detroit Lions running back David Montgomery. Where are your concerns with Monty heading into 2025?
Two things generally. One, it's John Morton replacing Ben Johnson. Montgomery's been in this weird running back rotation where he plays a lot in the first quarter and then they ease him out and ease Jahmyr Gibbs in, and that's not very common. And I don't know if Detroit's going to stick with that. Morton has talked a ton about wanting explosiveness in his offense, so there's been a lot of talk of Jamison Williams, a lot of talk of Gibbs, not as much talk about David Montgomery. And Morton, he hasn't really been an offensive coordinator, had his own offense, so we don't know exactly how his offense will look. But a lot of the offenses he's been a part of haven't really had a clear goal line back. It's just whoever is receiving the most carries ends up receiving the most goal line carries. So Montgomery is someone who has scored in 75% of his games over these past 2 seasons. I don't know if he's going to continue seeing as many of those goal line carries, which means fewer touchdowns for him. And then I also think with the losses they've had on the offensive line, that'll hurt his efficiency and lead the offense to turn elsewhere because they lost Frank Ragnow recently to retirement. Kevin Zeitler was lost in free agency. So that's two of their three interior linemen. Montgomery averaged 4.5 yards per carry when he was running between the tackles last year compared to 3.7 when he was running outside of the tackles. So now having those interior linemen lost, I don't think he'll be as effective running down the middle. And that's where he was running a lot of the time, where Gibbs was a bit more balanced running inside and outside. So if that's a part of their offense that isn't as effective when you have so many other options in the offense, I don't see them turning to Montgomery as much. And it's not very common to have two fantasy relevant running backs on the same team that you can start all the time. So while I still expect Montgomery to be one of the better number two options on a team, I don't know if that's going to continue being a case where he can be a top 24 running back like he's been these past few seasons.
Yeah, and it definitely feels like that's the expectation for him right now. Looking at the ADP, like he's going within the top 24 players at the position right now. And I have him outside of that range as well this season. So I'm with you. I think we could afford to be a bit lower on him, especially because I believe we're both higher on Jahmyr Gibbs as well. And for that to happen, there has to be a belief that Gibbs is going to take on a little bit of a larger role even from last season, which ultimately kind of comes at the cost of Montgomery's opportunities, right? Now, Gibbs, he did average more opportunities per game than Monty last season, but it wasn't like a significant margin. It was like 17.8 per game for Gibbs. Monty was 15.9. So it was pretty close. I think just considering how good and explosive Gibbs has been through 2 seasons already, we could see that gap get a little wider in his favor here in year 3. And I think, like you said, that could partly start around the goal line as well, because we saw Gibbs have success in that role last season. He took 16 carries inside the 5, converted 8 for touchdowns. And it's an area that had previously been mostly Montgomery. When he was in the lineup last year, he continued to dominate there as well, like nearly doubling the goal to go carries over Gibbs when he was in the lineup last season at like 29-15. So again, Gibbs just more effective in that role in general on the year as well, with a better rushing grade by far in those goal to go situations, 76.7 versus 62.9 for Montgomery. And that was even despite seeing a lower yards before contact per attempt average in those situations. Gibbs was seeing just 0.3 before contact, where Montgomery was seeing 0.7. So it's really just another area where we could start to see that shift in favor of Jahmyr Gibbs. And I tend to expect that, which is why I'm slightly higher on Gibbs and slightly lower on Montgomery this year as well. All right, let's talk about another running back who at least I'm lower on. That's Breece Hall of the New York Jets, going as RB13 on Underdog, RB10 on Sleeper. And as much as I could see, I guess the reasons for optimism for Hall, he was another one of those players where I found more reasons for optimism about the guys going around him or a little bit after him, right? And building in a number of the concerns that we kind of talked about last week when we were talking running back battles as well, right? Because you now have this Lions coaching staff coming over in Aaron Glenn, but also Tanner Engstrand, who was, I think he was the passing game coordinator for Detroit these past few seasons. So I don't think it would be a surprise to see a little more of those Lions backfield tendencies carry over here in New York, which means that Braylon Allen, who played well in his limited opportunities last year as a rookie, in fact, he was even better in rushing grade with an 82.0 in 2024 compared to Breece Hall, just 68.7. Breece Hall is yet to kind of regain that efficiency that we saw from him in his rookie year prior to the ACL injury. Like, that explosiveness just hasn't quite come back yet, which is always a concern for the position with guys coming off injuries. Now, I would imagine that, like most NFL teams, that there isn't this workhorse reliance on Breece Hall in 2025. And considering the history of where this coaching staff comes from, maybe we do see even more split in terms of touches. And I think with a bigger back like Allen, we could start to see that on early downs in short yardage situations, and especially around the goal line, right? And those were areas where even though Hall still got most of the looks there, Allen was still involved last year, and more importantly, much more effective. He earned a 90.0 rushing grade in short yardage situations on 18 attempts, while Brees Hall managed just a 72.6 on 23 attempts. And then Allen was much greater at avoiding those stuffed runs in those situations as well, which was key. Just 12.5% stuff run rate compared to 40.9% for Brees Hall, which was for Brees Hall, that was one of the 5 worst marks in the league at the position. And Braylon Allen was second best. So that's just one area where I think it could make a lot of sense for this coaching staff to lean into Allen over Hall, which combined with overall workload on rushing downs, like just really hurts, I think, the potential workload for Brees Hall. Now, I understand that there is a projection for how, or that this is a projection for how I think the team will deploy them. It's not necessarily a fact just yet, but we need to be able to kind of understand team tendencies and I think coaching changes and projecting forward. And that's where a lot of my concerns with Hall come from. But how about you, Nate? Because I understand that if Hall sees more of that workhorse workload, then this projection slash ranking of him outside of the top 15 for me could end up being off. So where are you at with Hall heading into 2025?
I'm in complete agreement. Along with everything that you've said, I think the zone runs that Detroit like to run. I think they'll run that in New York, which is different from what they did last year. And Hall, throughout his career, has averaged 5.6 yards per carry on gap runs compared to 3.7 on zone, while the other two running backs in New York were better on zone runs and gap runs. So the new coaching staff's pass tendencies also favor the younger running backs, and then that leaves Hall probably more in a receiving role, but I don't think he'll see a ton of targets in that role. Big reason for his decline in fantasy production last year was the lack of targets. He was seeing a 28.8% target rate the year before and 19.5% last year, so a significant drop with Aaron Rodgers, which was still higher than some running backs receive, but I could see it going even lower with Justin Fields at quarterback. When his time with the Bears, they were among the bottom teams in terms of targeting running backs, in part because Fields, instead of dumping off to running backs, either runs a lot or gets sacked a lot. So that's a lot of the passes that typically end up to running backs, and those are plays that stay with Fields. So I would not be surprised if Paul doesn't sees an even further decrease in targets, doesn't see as many runs. So I think the saving grace is I wouldn't be all that surprised if he gets traded. I believe this is his contract year, so if he's not being that effective part of the Jets offense, it could make sense for them to move on from him, in which case another team, maybe Washington, maybe Kansas City, he could be able to see a lot more fantasy value, in which case I'd probably be higher on Hall than where he's currently getting drafted. So I think that's the kind of saving grace for me, is that maybe he gets traded, in which case he has a lot of value, but I think as long as he stays in New York, I probably don't want him on my fantasy team.
Yeah, like I could definitely see like this being like a polarizing one because I know we want Hall to be good and we could visualize a path where, him being an RB1 in 2025 isn't impossible. And maybe even more so than like some of the other backs that I'll have ranked ahead of him. I just don't think it's likely, right? Because he isn't really that Jameer Gibbs level of talent right now that maybe he can be effective and efficient enough to either dominate the snaps or make up for the lower workload or, still, take over that receiving down role and be a fantasy starter for us. But we'll see, I guess. Like you said, the trade thing could very well become interesting here as we get closer to the season. We'll see how it shakes out. But let's talk about one more running back that you have listed here, Nate, and as a player to avoid at cost, and that's Cincinnati Bengals running back Chase Brown going as the RB11 on Underdog, RB13 on Sleeper. So where are you at with him right now?
I'm just a tad lower on him. I'm right around RB15 for him. I think we're just kind of projecting a little too much of him being able to do what he was doing at the end of last year. And he has a bit more competition for touches than he had at the end of the year. Samaje Perine is back on the team. He had been their passing down back. I think the big difference in what we'll see in that Perine won't just play on third downs, but I expect him to play significantly in the 2 minute drill, where Brown last season wasn't playing all that much on third down, so the third down stuff doesn't matter all that much, but the 2 minute drill time does. Brown was taking the majority of 2 minute drill snaps last year, and I don't think that'll be the case this year. Zach Moss should be back and healthy. They added Taj Brooks in the draft. They have more backup running backs than they had last year that they can trust on early downs, so I don't think they need Brown to handle quite as much of the workload. There was talk back at the combine of the Bengals not wanting to give him quite as much work because he has a smaller back to help keep him fresh, which will be good for his health in the long run. He'll remain a fantasy starter. The things about the Bengals will remain true where they should be scoring a lot of points, and some of those will be rushing touchdowns. So Brown should still see a decent amount of rushing touchdowns. The offensive line also remains a problem. They've been among the bottom of the league. I don't see that changing this year. So I think that hurts Brown's upside a little bit as well. So, and there's at least a chance he loses that starting job. I think Zach Moss, when Moss has been healthy, has played roughly as good as Brown when Brown's been healthy. I think there's at least a chance that Brooks is able to mix in. So I don't think Brown's job is entirely safe, even though there's a pretty decent chance he remains a starter, but just slightly less workload. I think there are other running backs around that range that I trust their workload a little bit more, trust that they'll remain the starter a little bit more, those kind of things. So that's why I have Brown where I have him.
Yeah, that was the case for me too. Because yeah, I'm slightly lower on Brown than consensus, but also like a little higher on him than you. Like I have him as RB 14, so like literally in that same spot. But yeah, the only things that really kind of pushed him down for me was again just being more optimistic about guys like Kenneth Walker and James Cook than where they're being drafted, and I like their potential a little bit more than Brown. That being said, like I don't have like significant concerns for Brown's like RB1 potential, I guess, just because the Bengals have showed a heavy reliance on him last season. He ended up getting about 18 opportunities per game on the year and was, relatively effective in that kind of Joe Mixon type role that they seem to like so much and want to deploy guys in, even if they aren't super efficient. And I feel like Brown is someone that they're at least comfortable with, like still, because they didn't really add to the backfield all that much, like at least until the sixth round with Taj Brooks in the draft. And I like Brooks, but being realistic, like he's a sixth round pick, so not like a true threat to snaps there. And then I don't think Zach Moss is like Zach Moss kind of lost that job to Brown last year. He wasn't healthy either. And then Samaje Perine, like I don't think a 30-year-old running back like he's going to have that big of a role either. Like you said, probably the 2 minute drill is a good spot for him to kind of stay if that's how they view him. But I felt fairly confident still that Brown would have a strong workload. But again, the thing that kind of pushed him a little lower for me was just how effective he could be in that role, because he wasn't, like you said, the most efficient runner last season. But I could live with the lower efficiency, just given the potential volume in a top tier offense. So he's still in that kind of fringe RB1 territory for me for now, at least. Okay, before we go on to the wide receivers, I do want to let you guys know that this episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. Now is still a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up, and it lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults, excuse me, and when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, let's talk about a different position now, the wide receivers, where we have three more names that we're considering kind of on the avoid list. And I think I'll start with one of my picks here, that being Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Xavier Worthy, who is going as the wide receiver 21 on Underdog, wide receiver 26 on Sleeper. And I just can't help but feel it's slightly too rich for me. And I fully understand that, he turned it on in the latter half of last year, took over a bigger role, was pretty effective, being more than, just a deep threat in Kansas City's offense. So if that role continued, then I could definitely see myself being wrong here. And I'm fine with that. But where the concerns for me comes in that it seems like Rashee Rice will be healthy and potentially avoid suspension. He was not in the lineup when Worthy took on that larger role. They also brought back Marquise Brown, who didn't join the team until week 16 last year. So he wasn't up to, being a consistent part of the offense while Worthy was more familiar and making his kind of run. And then they spent, an early day 3 pick on Jalen Royals as well, which I recognize not a big piece of target competition, but still someone who could play that underneath role that the Chiefs love so much. But the main thing for me is Rashee Rice, first and foremost, who we know how good he can be when he's healthy and just how much of a target hog that allowed him to be when he's on the field. And I do think he'll be on the field. It's really hard to imagine how that doesn't affect Worthy negatively, where maybe he does have to revert slightly back to that deep role, which is also something that Marquise Brown could provide. So maybe there's a little bit more shared usage there as well. But for Worthy, like I get that he's a first round pick. He has this elite speed that Kansas City will find him ways to get him the ball. But this is a team where if everyone is healthy, and that includes Rice and Travis Kelsey, like they can and will spread the ball around. So I have a hard time seeing how there will be enough for Worthy to be like a wide receiver 2 for us in 2025 where he's currently being drafted. So I am out on him at wide receiver 21, but Nate, where are you at with him? Because I do get folks will probably be more optimistic than I might be.
Oh yeah, I have him at wide receiver 27, and I think a lot of what I've seen, people are either high on Rice or high on Worthy, and that averages out among the wide receivers in terms of ADP. But we've seen Rice's grades, we've seen what Rice can do when he's healthy, we've seen what Worthy can do when he's healthy, and Rice has been more productive in that slot role in Kansas City than Worthy when Worthy had that role. And a lot of Worthy's success last season is when he had that role. He had a 24.1% deep target rate over the first 13 weeks, 11.7 average depth of target. Then over the last couple weeks and then the playoffs, that dropped to a 6.6 average depth of target, only a 12.5% deep target rate. And his yards per route run basically doubled in that role. So while Kansas City is a team that moves around their wide receivers a ton, which helps allow both of these wide receivers to play this role at times on various plays. So it doesn't have to be this black and white, Rice has the role or Worthy has the role. They will both have it at times over the course of every single game. But they did, like you said, add Jalen Royals, and they said they see a lot of Rashee Rice in Royals, which means that's also that slot role that they're fighting for. And the likely fifth wide receiver on the depth chart, Juju Smith-Schuster, that is also the role that he has had in the offense in the slot. So that's a lot of people who play that one role where there's only going to be one or sometimes two players on the field because Travis Kelsey can line up out wide, but it's really like Hollywood Brown's going to run those deep routes. And if it's not Brown, then it's probably going to be Worthy running those deep routes. And ideally, we see Kansas City just pass the ball deep more often. Having both of these wide receivers on the field could drastically change the offense like we thought it could last year, and it just never came about because the wide receivers were never healthy and playing well at the same time. So I think there's definitely a chance he can be a top 20 wide receiver, especially either if the offense is scoring a ton of points this year like they were a couple years ago, or if Rice isn't playing to the level he once was. But because I also believe in Rice, I think I have Worthy a wide receiver 27 or so just a tad lower than some places ADP.
Yeah, it's about where I have wide receiver 28 right now. So like look, a lot rides on Rice's potential suspension and health, but everything I keep seeing has been trending in the right direction for Rashee Rice heading into 25, and that just has me tempering expectations for Worthy here heading into year 2 basically. Okay, Nate, let's go on to one of your picks here as a player to avoid, and a much bigger name. It's ADP's wide receiver 3, CeeDee Lamb. So tell us what's got you lower on Lamb heading into 2025.
A ton of it is a lot of the stuff I said around Dak Prescott. We saw last season, obviously Lamb played better when Dak Prescott was healthy compared to when he was not healthy, but he was still only around wide receiver 7 when Dak was healthy, averaging 18.9 fantasy points per game. So 7th best, and had a notable drop in terms of his catch rate last season. It was 72.9% the year before, then it was 60.8% when Dak was healthy, and that is entirely due to the accuracy of Dak's passes. As I mentioned before, Prescott's passes were much less accurate last season, which led to Lamb's production dropping off even when Dak was healthy. So I could see some of that potentially continuing. I'm guessing Dak will get at least a little bit better in his accuracy and get closer to the player that he once was, even if he's not fully there. But even then, like I mentioned, the schedule is not great for not just the quarterback, but also the wide receivers. That'll make things more difficult for Lamb when they had been relatively easy for Lamb. So that's another shift in the wrong direction. And a lot of these players, we could be low on them by like a round or two by ADP. In this case, we're talking about a first round player. He is very consistently wide receiver 3 in terms of ADP or consensus rankings wherever you look. That puts him right around the middle of the first round, picks 5 to 7 in that range. So by being low on Lamb here, it just means I would rather take him in the later parts of the first round rather than the middle parts of the first round. There are some of these other young wide receivers that are up and coming that have more stable quarterback situations, better schedules, not as concerned about health since Lamb was also dealing with an injury last season. So we're relying on both Lamb and Prescott to be fully healthy and back to the players they once were in order for Lamb to be worth that wide receiver 3 price tag.
Yeah, no, I complete agreement. I think we've been pretty much in lockstep here with at least being lower on all of these players that we've talked about so far compared to consensus. And maybe surprisingly, that does not change here with Lamb because he's my wide receiver 5 at the moment. So a couple spots lower than that wide receiver 3 ADP as well. And I think I was maybe even a little surprised as well that he was the player I felt best about moving down the ranks within those top 5 wide receivers for the sake of two guys who I feel really good about heading into this year, Malik Neighbors and Puka Nakua. Now, I know that it's different players that you're higher on with Brian Thomas Jr. and Nico Collins. So that's where we start to differ. And I'm sure we could talk about that in a future episode. But it's interesting to me, at least, that it was the 2023 wide receiver 1, CeeDee Lamb, that we felt had to kind of move down a little bit, right? And I agree. If we're going to temper expectations for Dak, that's probably going to affect CeeDee Lamb at least a bit, right? And it was enough for me to push him to wide receiver 5. But like you said, not really creating a significant gap between him and the rest at the top because I think like he's still going to get plenty of targets in that offense, even with George Pickens in there. Like there should be plenty to go around. I believe we talked about that back when the Pickens trade happened, how often Dallas targeted the wide receiver position, but also he's still one of the best target earners in the league, plays the position at an elite level, which keeps him in that top 5 conversation for me. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if he finishes in that range once again, because even without Dak for the second half of last season and a drop off in efficiency with him gone, like he's still finished as the PPR wide receiver 4. So I don't hate the wide receiver 3 ADP, even though I have him as wide receiver 5. It's just a very tight knit group for me in that range there. Okay, one more wide receiver for today, and a player that I've included, and we actually touched on last week. So I know you're in agreement with me here, because if I remember correctly, you might be lower on him than even I am, and that's Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins, right? So Tyreek is going as wide receiver 17 on Underdog, wide receiver 13 on Sleeper. So this is ADP that I really dislike, and I have a hard time imagining myself pulling the trigger on him in that range for Tyreek, because even though we know the history of just how good he can be and especially how efficient he can be with that speed and that big playability, I agree with what you said last week. I thought you brought up a great point in that last year was likely more of a sign of things to come with Hill in where we should expect what we should expect from him as far as speed and efficiency starting to drop off, which isn't uncommon for players like Hill as they enter, their 30s, and he is now 31 years old. So last year's drop off in efficiency, specifically like yards per route run, was massive, and maybe he can bounce back a little bit from that. I don't think it's impossible considering like his typical career production. I just don't think it'll bounce back far enough to allow him to return to that kind of top 15 or maybe even top 20 potential. And that's kind of building in that I think this Miami offense will continue to just be around average at best. But if they're anything like last year, like they could certainly be worse than that as well. So, you factor in maybe Jalen Waddle also holds some potential to bounce back and maybe becomes the team's top wide receiver given, kind of his age and where he's at in his career. So I think I just struggled to get too excited about Tyreek Hill for 2025, at least enough to match his ADP. So I have him right on the fringe of that top 20. Might move him even lower for when by the time the wide receiver rankings come out, because he's wide receiver 20 in my rough draft right now, but could potentially be lower than that. So Nate, I know you're lower on him as well. So anything you want to add in regards to Hill, even if it means reasons for optimism for him this season?
Now, I'll just add some of the numbers to go along with what you were saying. His deep target rate fell from 21% to 15.7% last year. Contested target rate increased because he wasn't getting separation from 12% to 20.7%. Single coverage open rate going back to 2022 was open 52.4% of the time in 2022. That dropped to 44% in 2023, dropped even further to 38% in 2024. His NGS tracking data, his top speeds weren't as high last year as they have been every other year of his career. So he was listed at with a wrist injury, and that's been the thing that they've talked about with his decline in play of last year, is that the wrist injury caused things, and he really didn't have that high of a drop rate. So I don't think the wrist impacted all this other stuff we're talking about in terms of his ability to get away from defenders and those kind of things. So his game has been entirely built on speed. That's why he's been a Hall of Fame wide receiver, is his ability to get separation, get open, make those catches, and outrun everyone else. And if he's not able to do that, then that takes away what makes him special and makes him just a normal wide receiver. So I can kind of understand, especially in best ball, when you are trying to win this tournament with so many people, you're going almost entirely for upside. And yeah, there's a chance that there was some like undisclosed reason that he wasn't running as fast that he was able to return to his normal speed or something like that. So that's at least within the realm of possibility. Because of that, he, like CD Lamb, a top wide receiver in 2023, maybe he can return back to that form if there's something we don't know about, or he's able to turn back against age and is able to get faster again. But from everything that I've seen, I think he's not going to be the same receiver. And Miami does have a lot of other weapons, and their offensive line is not going to be as good, which is going to cause more problems for the offense. And the ball has to go around to everyone else as well. So, for those reasons, I don't think Hill's going to be one of those top wide receivers. I don't think he's probably even going to be in that wide receiver 2 range this year.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Like, I think, yeah, it's not impossible that he bounces back and be, a consistent fantasy starter for us. I just think if we're looking at the, outcomes that are most likely, I just feel like it's become less likely for him at this stage in his career for, again, all the reasons that you just laid out. So let's move on to our final position for today, the tight ends. Nate, we'll start with your pick here. New Denver Broncos tight end Evan Ingram going as the tight end 9 on both underdog and sleeper at the moment. So what are your concerns with Ingram at that price?
A lot of it has to do with Sean Payton and his offensive philosophy. We talked about it at the top of the show, of his philosophy to rotate among his skill players and how he does it at running back. He's similarly been doing that at tight end for forever now. Over the past 7 seasons where he's been a head coach, Jared Cook has the most routes per game at 24 in 2019. And that is not a lot of routes compared to what Evan Ingram is used to. And Peyton has a history of adding veteran tight ends near the end of their career and making them their primary tight end, going back to Jeremy Shockey, which I know is a long time ago at this point, but even then he was averaging 21 to 24 routes per game over the course of his 3 seasons. So we just have a long history of the tight ends being rotated out more often under Peyton, and even going all the way back even further, we've seen some tight ends see a little bit more playing time, but only if they are of that quality of player. And I don't think Ingram is quite there at this stage of his career. So even though there's been plenty of positive things said about Ingram since he's joined Denver, I think we will see plenty of good plays out of him, but only on a part-time basis. And it's, again, fantasy is a volume thing. And if he's only running 24 routes per game, then it's going to be very hard for him to get the volume compared to other tight ends who are more full-time players. So it's mostly because of how Sean Payton has used his tight ends in the past. And it's worth noting Ingram will be 31 by the time the season starts, and he is coming off of an injury. So those are other things that just generally are concerning for any receiver. So that goes along with it, and also goes along with the idea that they probably will rotate him out more because of his age and because of his recent injury history. It makes sense to limit his playing time in order to keep him healthy. So that's good for the Broncos. That's good for his ability to help the offense. That's not good for his fantasy production.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I just want to say I appreciate the reference to Jeremy Shockey. I always appreciate when you're able to bring back old names that make me reminisce, and just thinking about him as one of the more easier players to identify on the field, and a fun one to watch. But yeah, like there were I think I'm with you. Like there's a lot of I think positivity around Ingram right now. Like there's a lot of people are going to be excited about his potential in Sean Payton's kind of Joker role. And as far as tight ends go, like he's maybe not the worst candidate for that job. He's been a versatile enough receiving tight end that he could be effective in that role. Has some experience working out of the slot and out wide. He's not like this Mike Gesicki level big slot or anything like that. But that's why he's kind of maybe a good fit for this role, is because he can line up at tight end as well, and they can utilize those mismatches and coverages there as well. And like you said, Peyton, he hasn't had a strong history of great receiving tight ends. I think some of that just has to do with the players available to him. So I don't think it's crazy to consider like a step up for the position than what Peyton has deployed previously, which should really help that maybe overall tight end target rate. But that being said, like you said, he's going to be 31 years old, coming off a season-ending injury, dealing with injuries even prior to that. It's a new offense than what he's used to, that allowed him to kind of be, last year was a highly targeted option in Jacksonville. But yeah, it doesn't mean it can't work. Like I have him as tight end 10 right now. So again, slightly lower on consensus as well. But I think even with the heavy rotation of wide receivers, like he has at least some potential to emerge as maybe the second best and most consistent option in the receiving game next to Cortland Sutton in Bo Nix's passing offense. So that's kind of what kept him in that tight end one range for me, though. I am incredibly tempted to move the rookies like Colson Loveland and Tyler Warren ahead of them. I just don't love their situations as much right now, even though I think they're more talented than Ingram. So maybe I could still be swayed there. I think he could be afforded to move down a little bit as well. All right, and lastly, Nate, as you know, as much as you hate the Dallas Cowboys, it seems. No, I kid. I might be perceived as hating the Kansas City Chiefs because I have two Chiefs players on the list here for my guys to avoid. And next to Xavier Worthy, it's Travis Kelce for me. He's going as tight end 6 on Underdog and Sleeper. I have him as tight end 8 right now, and for similar ish reasons to start that I had with tempering Worthy's expectations for this year surrounding a potential Rashee Rice return that is bound to impact, I think, Taylor Swift's boyfriend as well. So, you look at the games where both Rice and Kelce were in the lineup. So almost all of 2023, including the playoffs, and then week 1 to 3 last season as well included. 25% target rate for Rice, 22% for Kelce. Rice, 2.36 yards per route run, 1.87 for Kelce, 88.7 receiving grade for Rice, 85.9 for Kelce, 24.6% target rate in the red zone for Rice, 22.8% for Kelce. And well, all of that has, been even more one-sided in like the 3 games that Rice played last year, even on the larger sample size, like to include Rice's rookie season where he wasn't a consistent fixture in the offense until like post bye week. I think for them, Rice was still very clearly like is their top option. Now, the other part of it for me is that Kelce suffered a pretty clear drop off in his own personal metrics last season, as is kind of expected for a player who will turn 36 years old this year, right? He finished last year with a career low 71.7 PFF grade, career low receiving grade. It was his first time posting under 1,000 yards, including the playoffs, where he played 3 additional games on the year. It was his first time doing that since his rookie season. He had a career low yards per route run, yards per reception. Everything took a hit last season, and I have a hard time imagining like he has a better year at this stage in his career. Like, sure, he is still finished. He still finished last year as the tight end 5 overall, but he was also just tight end 8 in points per game. And even if he stays healthy again, like I could picture myself ranking him, you know, over. I can't picture myself ranking him over the first 7 guys that I have in my tight end rankings right now, which is McBride, Bowers, Kittle, Hawkinson, Laporta, Andrews, and Jonnu. Now, if Jonnu, hey, if he goes to Arthur Smith's fantasy tight end hell, then maybe I think I can make an argument for him there. But I think there's still other names in that range as well, including like some of the rookies or even David Njoku. So I'm probably not going to be drafting much Kelce this year at cost. So what do you think, Nate? Too harsh to have the former 6-time tight end 1 at tight end 8?
I don't think so, given his age. And like you said, with Rasheed Rice playing well, and then even in the playoffs last year when Xavier Worthy had his two really high graded games in the conference championship game and Super Bowl, Kelsey caught 6 passes for 58 yards over those two games. So when either one of those wide receivers has played really well, Kelsey hasn't done much. And now both of these wide receivers will ideally be healthy the entire year. We also saw Kelsey's avoided tackles drop significantly. He was at 19 in 2021, then 24, then 17, and then last year that was down to 3. So he is not avoiding tackles anymore. His yards after the catch similarly went down. It's gone from 6.2 to 6.0 to 5.0, all the way down to 3.5 last year. So we've seen his tracking metrics also decrease in terms of his speed. Was also only targeted once in the end zone when they were near the red zone last year, because defense is obviously going to focus entirely on Kelsey when the Chiefs are there, and that'll probably continue to be the case. So I don't see Kelsey's touchdowns necessarily bouncing back. So completely agree with you on Kelsey.
Yeah, look. I mean, he's had a really nice run. Obviously, like first ballot Hall of Famer, is going to have a really nice set up for a nice life after football as well. But I think for fantasy football this year, I think that's pretty much as optimistic as I could get for him right now. Is that tight end 8 range? So still too rich for me in ADP, but that's going to do it for us today. So Nate, I now have to go sing "Oh Canada" 10 times and take a shower in order to make up for being this negative for an entire episode. But hey, we can't love every single player at ADP. That's not helpful to anyone. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. Otherwise, a piece of my soul died for nothing. And at the very least, you can like and subscribe to the channel to help me out. We would all greatly appreciate that. Nate, thank you as always for going through this with me. Please remind everyone what you have going on at pff.com this week.
I am still grinding out the player profiles, all 10 players that we talked about today. If you want even more detail on them, I've written about all of them. Prescott will be out on Thursday, but the other 9 are currently on the website. Have 130 plus other player profiles. If you want to know my opinion on anyone else that's drafted in the first 10 or so rounds of the draft, we'll continue doing that for the rest of June to get to around the top 200 or so players.
Love it. Yeah, as for me, we have 5 more ADP battle articles going up on the site this week, including Brees Hall versus James Cook, Brock Bowers versus Trey McBride, Joe Mixon versus RJ Harvey, and plenty more. And then Nate and I will be back next week talking some 2025 positional rankings. So hopefully you'll tune in for that. And until next time, peace out.